Dr. Melvyn Fein is a certified clinical sociologist and professor of sociology at Kennesaw State University. He holds a doctorate in sociology from the City University of New York, and he's the author of many books. If you go on Amazon.com, it's a very impressive group of books that he's authored over the years, including Post-Liberalism, The Death of a Dream, which he wrote in 2012, The Limits of Idealism, When Good Intentions Go Bad, in 1999, a book called Race and Morality, How Good Intentions Undermine Social Justice and Perpetuate Inequality, which he wrote in 2001, and the book that probably caught my attention the most, given our current cultural situation, politically and otherwise, is a book that Dr. Fein wrote many years ago called Integrated Anger Management. Very appropriate for our current scene. And also, it came to mind as I was trying to work my way through this unbelievable traffic just to get here tonight. So, Integrated Anger Management, a common sense guide to coping with anger. I think I'll check that out pretty closely. Now, Dr. Fein is also a weekly columnist for the Marietta Daily Journal, which is where he first came to my attention several years ago. And over the course of his career, Dr. Fein has been a fearless critic of political correctness, the intolerant liberal tyranny that dominates academia and higher education. Now, about a year ago, Kennesaw State University invited Angela Davis, the militant radical and former Black Panther, to speak on Martin Luther King Day, a rather inappropriate choice in terms of bringing someone to honor Dr. Martin Luther King. And of course, the university paid her $20,000 out of mandatory student activities fees. I wrote an editorial for the Marietta paper. You might have picked up a copy of it back there on the paper, on the table. It's called KSU, Angela Davis, and the Academic Industrial Complex. Now, in the article, I noted that the true cost of higher education cannot be measured in dollars alone. Far more troubling than the enormous increase in tuition is the social, the political, and the moral climate on our campuses. Ideologically, most of these colleges and universities function literally, not just hyperbolically, but literally, as cultural Marxist indoctrination centers, undermining the very values that led to the founding of these institutions generations ago. As the Princeton University philosopher Richard Rorty commented several years ago, professors have one primary purpose: to assure that students who enter college with traditional conservative or Christian values leave college with views more like our own. He's speaking for himself here. Leave with values more like me, he's saying. He warned parents they must accept the fact that, quote, we are going to go right on trying to discredit you in the eyes of your children, ridiculing your values to the point that your views seem silly rather than discussable. So this is the kind of liberal fascism that Dr. Fein has devoted his career to combating, and this is why, in particular, we wanted to invite him here tonight to discuss how political correctness is corrupting and destroying academia and higher education in America. So it's indeed an honor and a privilege to have Dr. Fein with us, and please extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Melvyn Fein.
I don't know where to begin. Dr. Bashir's talked about Angela Davis coming to our campus. Yes, indeed. In point of fact, I had a conversation with our president, Dr. Papp, after that happened. He was extraordinarily distressed because it had not gone up to his level. It had been a decision made below him at not even the college level. And he was beside himself in the inappropriateness of this selection, which is why we subsequently brought Ann Coulter to campus as a kind of balance. People have been doing this for a long time. Years earlier, after the bell curve came out, we had Charles Murray on campus. but he couldn't be invited alone. He had to be brought in with Alvin Toussaint, a liberal psychiatrist from Harvard, so to disabuse people of the mistakes that they made. Earlier than that, when Newt Gingrich first hit the political scene, he offered to teach a series of courses at KSU, and he was disinvited. He was disinvited because people in my then department objected, and so I had a first-hand view of liberal academics trying to exclude views with which they disagreed. This is an absolute common phenomena. In order to combat this, I've been championing something called marketplace of ideas, and trying to bring different ideas, both from the left and right on campus, to have a dialogue, to people speak openly and honestly about these things. Our last speaker this past year was Dr. Peter Wood, who was the head of the National Association of Scholars, and he talked about the political correctness and trigger warnings and microaggressions and all of that kind of stuff. In point of fact, several people in the philosophy department objected to his coming. And the dean told me this later on and said how ironic that philosophers who are supposedly interested in ideas are not interested in ideas that contradict their own. So this is a phenomenon that we deal with, on a regular basis. Obviously, it's not just KSU we're talking about. The University of Missouri business there, and the Yale students who have been speaking out against microaggressions and anything that they find uncomfortable. They want trigger warnings. They want to be told ahead of time that this will offend them. And of course, many conservative speakers like Condoleezza Rice have been disinvited from college campuses, been refused honorary degrees and so on, because it is absolutely true that the atmosphere on campus is liberal and, yes, indeed, neo-Marxist. It absolutely and truly is, and people will deny it. In fact, the most left-wing member of my own department insists that he's a moderate. This is a man who is left of Karl Marx, but everybody seems to think that they're in the middle. And so these folks do not perceive themselves as radicals, they do not perceive themselves as extremists, they perceive themselves as level-headed human beings who are trying to save society as they see it. And what they see is basically a corrupt society, an evil society. Now, I'm a sociologist, and sociologists have been swallowed whole by identity politics. If you go and look for books by sociologists nowadays, well, first of all, you're going to find very few in bookshops because nobody's interested in them. But if you happen to read them, you will see it's all about discrimination against blacks, discrimination against women, discrimination against gays, discrimination against poor people. It's all about the negative, horrible things that our society has done. And like many revolutionaries, and by the way, the last book that I had published this past fall was called Evolution versus Revolution, in which I tried to demonstrate that revolutions never work. Not hardly ever work. They never work. One of the reasons they never work is that revolutionaries are always against something. They want to get rid of the evil, the establishment, whatever it may be. They don't think ahead to what they want to institute. And so you get, Soviet Russia, you get communist China, you get communist Cuba, you get Venezuela, you get all kinds of terrible, terrible examples that are habitually thought of as just simple errors, the wrong leader. If we just get the right leaders, everything will be okay. It never occurs to them that we've been playing this game for over 100 years and somehow it's never the right leaders. And, it never occurs to them that maybe that's because their ideas attract the wrong leaders. There's no doubt whatsoever that the folks in universities are almost uniformly liberal and left of liberal. That includes my department, although I must tell you that my department is fairly moderate as these things go. I'm definitely the only conservative in the department. My wife is in the department and she's absolutely flat out in the middle. And we don't have any firebrands, except, well, maybe one or two. And one of them is actually a fairly responsible person. But the university itself is riven through and through with folks with very, very strong left-leaning commitments. A couple of years ago, many of these folks wanted to start a new department, the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies. Basically, the feminists who were not sociologists or psychologists, the folks in the English department or education, wanted to teach their favorite theories, and they wanted a platform, and by golly, they agitated for one, and now they've got it, and all of the most radical folks have been swept up into one rather unneat little pile in which they can talk about feminism and so forth. In fact, their latest hobby horse is they want a new degree in peace studies, which strikes me as very peculiar because these folks haven't the foggiest idea what brings peace. Basically, they think, like the communists thought, get rid of the bad guys, folks like me, and peace will break out. I argued against this with the provost, and they said to me, well, look, we'll try it, and if they don't get any students, we'll discontinue it. And, but I've discovered that, they don't discontinue these things. They get started and they get a life of their own. Years ago, we started a major in African and African diaspora studies. Now, we have a significant number of black students at KSU nowadays, between 15 and 20%. But in point of fact, these students generally know better than to major in something like this. And that radical sociologist I told you about, he migrated over to become the head of this department. And a couple of years ago, he put out a newsletter explaining how well the program was doing, how, in fact, it had doubled in size over the last year. And what he didn't inform his readers was that it went from 2 majors to 4. And these folks don't specialize in honesty. But they don't realize that. They are too committed. They don't listen to folks like me. I've been at KSU now for 25 years, and I have offered to debate anyone, anytime, about any subject. I've had one taker, and he's since discontinued. You're not going to do it because these folks think they're brilliant, but they're not ready to measure their beliefs and evidence against somebody who is reasonably articulate. They're used to an empty field. They're used to being on a stage with people who agree with them, and they pat each other on the back and tell themselves how wonderful they are, and they're forever telling their students how wonderful they are and how they are going to save the world. What they do not do is they do not give opposing opinions. When I first started, I tried to be even-handed. I must confess I'm less even-handed nowadays. Mind you, as a sociologist, you have to teach Marx, and I do. I teach him as honestly as I can, and after I present Marx the way I think Marx would like to be presented, I then tell the students why I think he's wrong. And of course, this is the first time they've heard anything of that sort. And so in some ways I'm lucky in that the students who take me, at least who elect to take me, usually have some idea of what they're getting into, and they tend to be a little more conservative than in some other areas. You know, Dr. Papp, when I talked to him about this, he knows that the students are being corrupted. He's well aware of that, and what he has told me on more than one occasion is, don't worry, they'll grow out of it. And some of them no doubt will. I mean, I'm one of those people. I was telling folks at dinner earlier, I'm exactly the same age as Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders went to Madison High School in Brooklyn, New York. Had I lived 2 blocks east of where I did, I would have gone to Madison High School at the same time he went. I know Bernie Sanders. I know where he came from. I know the attitudes, and I know that people like him honestly believe that they are trying to make the world better. But you know, that was more than 50 years ago, and I've learned a thing or two. Folks like Bernie don't seem to learn. This is an honest fellow. This is a man who is utterly sincere, but that doesn't mean he's been exploring the world beyond what he was initiated into as a young person. Well, he's not alone. You can find a lot of those folks on college campuses. And oh, by the way, they try to have their way. And so, let me tell you a little bit of my own odyssey. I came down to Kennesaw from upstate New York. I came down because they were looking for a clinical sociologist. That's what I was trained in, and to start a program. And I discovered once I got here that the dean wasn't going to let me do it, so I had to move in other directions. I thought I was doing pretty well. I thought I was getting along with people. I was the only one in the department who had written any books at that time. And I was getting good student evaluations, and I thought, hey, no problem getting tenure. Now, the department that I was in had grown larger, and it was split off, and we got a new department, and that meant a new chair. And I helped this new person get her position. When I went up for tenure, she told me she was on my side, that she would help me get tenure. When I put in for it, it went well enough on the department level, I was approved. And then it went to the chair. Now, at each level, they're supposed to let you know, there's a report supposed to be sent to you. The chair never sent me a letter. The next letter I got was from the college committee, and they turned me down. And they turned me down on the basis of what the chair had said. Well, I'd never seen what the chair had said. This is the first time I got a copy of her report. I got it from the committee, not her. And then she proved me, but it was she damned me with faint praise, if you know what I mean. And I went to her, and because I was shocked. This was supposedly a friend who was supposedly helping me. How could this be? And I sat there, and she said, very calmly, well, it's not working out. This is the first time I'd heard anything of that sort. And I said, what are you talking about? And I tried to defend myself, and she became louder, and her language became offensive, and I realized, oh, I have an enemy. And by this time I knew enough that when you have an enemy, you shut up. You're not going to persuade them, and you darn well don't want to give them any ammunition they can use against you. So I let her abuse me. And what I did was I wrote a letter in my defense and went up to the dean. Well, we had a new dean at that time. And she read my defense, and she approved it. Because what had been said about me was just absurd. But then it went to the vice president of academic affairs. And he turned me down. In fact, he ultimately got this dean fired. So that first year I went up for tenure. I didn't get it. And my chair, you understand, was a feminist, a very strong feminist. And she disapproved of my opinions. I make no secret of them, and this is when I found out that she was going to take it out and make sure that I was not going to be around to corrupt any of our students. All right. But it had been a bruising battle that first year. So later on, the chair came to me and said, look, she offered to make me a deal. She said she wouldn't oppose me if this next year I went up for promotion and not for tenure. Now, I knew that she was looking for a way to deny me tenure, but my calculation was, if you promote me 1 year, how can you deny me tenure the next year? So, that second year was pretty quiet, but I knew she was getting ready to do her worst. And the next year, when I went up to the college, to the department committee, now not just for tenure, what she did is she packed the department committee with her allies, even though several of them did not have tenure themselves, which is something she shouldn't have done. But she wanted the votes on her side. And so there were 6 people on the committee. And these committees usually meet for half an hour, an hour at most. This committee met twice for a total of between 6 and 7 hours. They could not come up with a decision. It seems that 2 of the folks were my allies, 2 of the folks were my enemies, and 2 abstained each and every time. Eventually, the chair of the committee, who was an ally of the department chair, said, let's do a secret ballot. All right, they did the secret ballot. They put the little pieces of paper in front of him. He scooped up the pieces of paper, put them in his pocket, said, I'll count them over the weekend, and I'll let you know what the answer is. Yeah. One of my allies happened to run into him, witnessed him coming back to the department. The department chair asked him, how did it go? And he apparently patted his pocket and said, I got what I wanted. Well, guess what? They voted against me. Then the chair wrote her letter, also denying me. And I'll never forget, it was 7 or 8 pages, single-spaced, listing every sin I had committed since I was 3 years old. And mind you, to do that, she had to do a lot of cherry picking. So I'll give you one of the things that she said, because it was, by this time I was savvy enough to play the political game. You see, earlier she had said to me, oh, the reason you're not getting tenure is because of the narrative in which you explain your teaching philosophy and so on is very, very weak. The associate dean doesn't like it, Why don't you consult him and see if you can improve it? Well, in point of fact, I did. I consulted the associate dean, and he sent me a letter back saying, no, he thought my narrative was perfectly okay. He thought it was terrific, no problems at all. But what I did is I took that letter and I put it in the drawer, and I didn't let the chair know that I'd gotten it. And so when she wrote her letter about me, she said, you see, Dr. Fein is so uncollegial that when I advised him to check, he didn't even check. Well, you see, now I brought the letter out. And I had checked. In other words, I knew enough to let her walk out on a limb, and then I sorted off behind her. By this time, too, one of my colleagues, who had initially been trying to mediate between us, had realized that she was not being reasonable. He was one of these, this is the man who won Professor of the Year for the whole university. He was really beloved, and he was just a very reasonable, nice guy, a liberal, by the way. But we used to go to meetings together, and we used to argue about politics, and then afterwards we would sing songs. And he was actually a cantor in a Greek Orthodox church, and when we ran out of songs we knew, he would sing from the church. So that was a lovely experience. An honorable man, and when he realized that the chair was not being honorable, he was distressed, and he started asking for documents. And one of the documents he got was a series, or it was actually a series of documents of memos between the chair and the vice president, in which they were basically plotting about how they could get rid of me. And we had it on paper. And so now, I let it be known that if they tried to get rid of me, I would sue them. Mind you, they had lost a suit from a Jewish professor the previous year based upon discrimination and had to pay over $1 million. Now, I'm not sure whether the fact that I'm Jewish had anything to do with it. I think the fact that I'm liberal had a lot to do with it. I'm conservative and liberal had a lot to do with it in any event. When I threatened to sue, and they knew that I had documentation, they backed off. Then an emissary came from the vice president offering to buy me and my colleague off. The offer was they would give me tenure, and they would give us a separate department of sociology, and they would give us a major in sociology, which we had not had until that time. And I said, and my colleague said, sure. And that's how we got our department, and how we got a new chair, and we got control of our own destiny, and we could do it, or get it away from the political correctness stuff. The last thing that happened, incidentally, was that after I was approved by the university committee, the vice president, who I knew was not a friend, called me up to tell me that it was a close-run thing, that I was not a collegial person. That's the charge. I was not collegial, you see. I was not part of the team, okay? And so it was a close-run thing, and I had better watch my P's and Q's because, hey, you know, you're not really fitting in here. Well, by that time, I had the spy in the committee. And the spy told me that the vote had been 8-2 in my favor. 8-2. So I knew it was not close. But I said nothing, because I now knew what I was dealing with, what kind of a person I was dealing with. In other words, if you're going to survive in a situation like this, you better be politically astute. You better be prepared to defend yourself. By the time this happened to me, I knew how to do that, and this was a battle that I won. A lot of other folks, they don't play the game, they don't win. Or many of them simply go underground and keep their mouths shut because they're afraid they'll get into trouble otherwise. I've had many of my colleagues come to me in private and say, you know, I'm a conservative, but don't let anybody know. By the way, they're thinking about having a major in religion at KSU. I hope you know it's not going to be taught by believers. Well, this is where we stand. I mean, and it's not going to change. It's getting worse and worse. I mean, some of you may have seen that in places like Harvard, the faculty members, 95% contribute there to democratic causes, to the Democratic Party. Almost no conservatives. These folks are a self-perpetuating elite. They honestly believe, and many of them have said so in print, that you can't have conservatives because they're stupid. Yeah. I've been called a lot of things. Very rarely have I been called stupid. But that doesn't matter. If they don't want you, they're going to try to get rid of you. They're going to try to make your life uncomfortable. Now me, I've learned a thing or two. I've learned to protect myself. I know that if you're in a large organization, you need allies. One of my allies is the president of the university, another is the provost, another is the dean, another is the chair of my own department. I'm in good shape. You know, in the wake of this Black Lives Matter thing, and the problem that they had at University of Missouri, and the folks in Yale and other places looking for, safe places on campus where they don't hear any offending opinions. Well, the Black Lives Matters targeted KSU, and they sent a list of demands, and they made a whole series of demands specifically to the president, and then they cited one professor whom they found particularly objectionable. But it never got down to my level. The president never called me to say, what are you going to do? The provost never called me. The dean never called me. I only found out about a week and a half ago that my chair and the dean had been having a conversation based upon this accusation, the accusations made against me. And it never got down to my level because they both agreed that the accusations were without any merit whatsoever. And that their job was to protect me, not to exactly pound the flesh from me. Now understand this. I just wrote a book about courage. My original title was going to be called Courage for Cowards, because I always thought of myself as a coward. I was pretty much abused by my father as a child and was afraid of the world. And that was part of my self-identity. And when I got to be an adult, I did all kinds of things. I was in the army, I worked in Harlem alone, I worked in a methadone clinic, broke up knife fights, I did a lot of things. I was a cab driver in New York City, and the homicide rate against cab drivers is worse than for police officers. So I've done a lot of dangerous things, but I never thought that that was a matter of courage. I always thought this was something that I did, that I had to do. By the same token, I have always stood up and said what I think in public. I have never backed away from my principles, ever. I never thought that was a big deal. But I look around our society and I go, oh my goodness, it is a big deal. And you know what? Maybe I have some courage, maybe more than a bunch of other folks. I don't know about you, but when Ben Carson came out for Donald Trump and said that it was okay what Donald was doing in terms of his vulgarity and his nastiness, because that's the way the game is played. And this was a man, Dr. Carson, who was advertising himself as the voice of morality. And the voice of morality says, it's okay for people to be vile and vicious because that's the way the game is played. It scares me. It scares me that this is where we've come as a society. The current assistant chair in our department, who is a very narrow-minded person, I talk to my wife about this kind of thing, who's also a member of my department and had been the assistant chair. And this other new person, we asked, well, what's our criteria for making a decision? Her decision is always, what's the rule? What's the rule? She always wants a rule. I need a rule, so I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. My wife, on the other hand, her question is more often, what's going to work? What can we do? What can succeed? My question is always, what's right? It's always the first question, what's the right thing to do? And it surprises me that so few people ask that question at all. Now, I know you folks are interested in religion, in Christianity. I'm not going to sail under false colors. I'm an agnostic. I was raised as a Jew. My wife, incidentally, is evangelical, but a lukewarm evangelical. But one of the reasons I get along with Dr. Bashir's and a lot of some of you folks who I've met before is I'm pretty sure you folks are looking to do the right thing too. And to find out what the right thing is and to see that it makes a difference. Some of my colleagues at KSU, the most liberal, the most radical, would probably say the same thing. Only they're very narrow. They see the world through one set of lenses only. The world is more complicated than that. I teach a course in social change. One of the things I am teaching, or telling my students over and over again, is the world is complicated. It is so complicated. It is so hard to know what to do. And then I look at the society, especially the politicians, pushing easy, simple answers, dishonest answers. And then I look at the public accepting this, and I go, oh my God. You know, when I have a theory of morality and whatnot, but one of the things that I do when I'm trying to teach this is the nature of morality and what's it all about. I like to be provocative in the classroom, so what I will do is I will go up and I say, oh, this is a gun, and I'm going to shoot so-and-so, bang, you're dead. Now, as I was saying, and I go on talking about this and blah, 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 okay? And then, you know, and then I ask them, well, what if I'd actually shot so-and-so? How would you have responded? Would we have simply gone on with our conversation? Well, if we had gone on with our conversation, that would mean you don't think that murder is wrong. If you believe something is immoral, you are outraged by it. If you're not outraged by it, you don't really think it's immoral. I watch people lying like crazy and being caught in lies. And are they outraged? I witnessed a Secretary of State being utterly irresponsible with national secrets and people not being outraged. I have been watching this over and over again in all kinds of ways over the last couple of decades. And I'm saying, do Americans believe in morality anymore? You've heard it many times, I'm sure, that we owe people unconditional positive regard. That we're supposed to be non-judgmental. And in moments like this, I say, well, with Adolf Hitler, you mean we should have given him a hug? It's okay, Adolf, you had a tough childhood. We understand. I mean to say, there's an awful lot of nonsense out there. And if some of you are outraged by it, believe me, I share your outrage. If some of you are looking for a way to handle this, I understand that too. By the way, in my book on courage, one of the things that I do address is, can you use religion for courage? And the answer I give is, yes, you can. Doesn't work for me, but it works for people, and I find that perfectly okay. And Dr. Bashir and I were talking about this at lunch a while back, and when I was younger, religion was the bugaboo, and the Inquisition was the bugaboo destroying science. I was opposed to the Inquisition. Well, I'm just as opposed to an Inquisition against religion. I am appalled that people are not standing up for Christianity. I'm not a Christian, but I understand what we owe to Christianity. I understand that Christianity deserves respect on the university level. You don't have to agree with the position in order to respect it. I am appalled that it is not respected in the university. It is not respected by intelligent people. One of the things that I'm aware of when I come to a group such as this is that I am speaking to intelligent people who are committed to doing the best they can, that this is not recognized and simply accepted is I find intolerable. So, I want to make it plain that even though I know you and I are going to disagree about some things, I want to make it perfectly plain that I think there are some things in which we honestly do agree. Dr. Bashir, am I okay?
Yes, sure. Whenever you want to open it up for Q&A is fine.
Well then, you know, it's sort of like, hey, I was asked how long I want to speak, and my answer to that is, how much time do I have? You know, I can do it in 10 minutes, I can do it in 10 hours, but I like Q&A, and I like Q&A in this group, so why don't we just do Q&A if that's okay with you, or I can keep talking if you want me to. You're like my students. I say, what do you think? And I get no response.
We have a saying here, we say no one likes to ask the first question, so we go directly to the second question.
Oh, okay. Let's go directly to the second
We've got time for you. Let Dr. Fein have a minute to rehydrate. The Rubio move has become known as.
Somebody likes Rubio? I like Rubio.
They used to.
He was my guy. He was my guy. You know, hey, this is one of the things that kills me. Here is the most honorable person running. This is a man who is absolutely not rich at all, who had every opportunity to get rich over his office and clearly did not, and that was held against him. This is a man who was trying to come up with reasonable solutions for immigration and what have you, and it's held against him. This is a man who refused to insult other folks. He tried a little bit. Obviously he didn't do it well, because it's not his style. But it was held against him. You're weak. You're weak for trying to be reasonable and decent. I found that appalling. I'm going to do a little political lobbying here. Anybody but Trump and Hillary. But not Bernie either.
Mel, I know a little bit about your background, but not that much. I know you were raised in Brooklyn in a fairly religious Jewish family.
No.
Okay.
No. I was raised in Brooklyn by a family that was not religious.
Oh, okay.
In other words, in point of fact, I was sent to Hebrew school, but my father didn't know Hebrew, and when we had the Passover ceremony, I, a kid of 11 years old, read from the ceremony because my father didn't know how to read it.
Oh.
His father did, but my father didn't. My maternal grandfather was in fact an atheist. And when he was invited to the Passover ceremony, he laughed at it. Okay? No. Meanwhile, what has happened, I have two siblings, a sister and a brother. My brother is a flat-out atheist, vigilant, a militant atheist. My sister is Orthodox Jewish. We run the whole bloody gamut. Okay? Because what happened was they allowed us to be whatever we wanted to be.
Okay. Well, I know that early in your life you were a socialist.
I was very much a socialist. Yes, indeed.
Would you mind sharing briefly about your political conversion?
Absolutely.
Why did you disavow the left?
Absolutely. Look, by the way, I don't know if you're aware of this. I don't know, I shared you. Probably the first occupational choice I made was when I went to Hebrew school, I thought I might become a rabbi. Didn't quite stick. But I wanted to do the right thing, and I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody was socialists. It's part of the Jewish tradition, if you're not aware of it. Socialism was the way the European Jews protected themselves against a society in which they were outcasts. This was for them a way in which everybody could be one big family, whether you were Jewish or not Jewish. And so there's a deep kind of attachment to it, almost a religious attachment to it in the Jewish community. In other words, people get rid of their religion, but they don't get rid of their leftist views, you know. So 70% of Jews, even though they're rich, they're still voting like they were poor. Be that as it may. In other words, but it was, I got this at home, I got this at school, I got this from everyone. It was the way. Why shouldn't we all work together? Why should people be selfish? Socialism was about not being selfish and everyone supporting everyone else. Okay? That's the way I got it. And I learned it that it was the rational way to be. It was that there was all of the best minds agreed to this. This is a fact. Then when I got to college, about halfway through college, maybe a little further, two of my friends, we were all philosophy majors, and they converted from philosophy to economics. And when they became economics majors, they converted and became conservatives. Son of a bitch. Well, after we graduated, we became roommates. And for one solid year, it was 2-1 against me. I was for socialism, they were for, well, one of them became a libertarian. Both of them became, by the way, economics professors. One is at Loyola University, so, you know, distinguished professor at Loyola of New Orleans. The other was at UCLA, and at one point people were talking about nominating him for the Nobel Prize in economics. So, of the three, I'm the one who's done the worst. In any event, we argued like crazy. And I gave not an inch. But it introduced me to all kinds of ideas that I had never heard of. For example, Milton Friedman, if you are aware of him, I didn't know who he was. One of my friends subsequently went out to the University of Chicago. I went out to the University of Wisconsin. I visited, and I got in to sit in classes of Milton Friedman's. Now, mind you, still didn't convert me, but it made me think. One of the things that I have learned over time is when you have a deeply held view, you don't give it up. You don't give it up, even if you have doubts. It's something that you have to work through on your own, you know, piece by piece before you change. Probably before I was 30, I was now considering myself a conservative, because during this period I read a lot more, I was aware of a lot more than I had previously, and there was a hurdle that I had to get over, and it was that in switching to be a conservative, I felt like I was betraying my heritage. I was betraying my family. That was a difficult thing to do. Okay? Actually, one of my uncles, my favorite uncle, who was just a sweetheart of a man, you know, who I used to argue politics with, and we'd have these conversations, long conversations, and they never ended argumentatively because he was a nice guy. But after we got to, you know, the end, he would go, "Where did I go wrong? Where did I go wrong?" Because, you know, one of his sons also made the journey to the right. Anyway, once I got over to the right, I was in a live-in relationship that fell apart. You know, it's all kinds of things. Didn't know which end was up, and very, very gradually started to get a sense of what I wanted to do. And it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s that I went back to school in sociology, because sociology was asking the questions I was interested in, and it was a science. It was empirical. You could go out in the world and you could observe what's true, what's not true. It wasn't merely opinions. So in many ways I've been asking some of the same questions that I asked when I was in philosophy, but I've been asking them as a scientist, only with a big, big difference from some of my colleagues. You see, many of them, they got into the ivory tower, they escaped reality, if you will. They never walked the streets of Harlem alone. They were never in the middle of a knife fight between people in a methadone clinic. They've never been in poverty-stricken homes or had people come toe-to-toe with them and threaten them with physical mayhem. They've never had to go on food stamps as I did when I went back to school and ran out of money. I've had real-life experiences that help me understand when I run into nonsense, when I hear idealistic foolishness being spouted by my colleagues. I'll give you an example. When I was in welfare in New York City, and this was, I don't know, was it the 60s or 70s? It was way back when. It was during the period when there was the riots going on. Actually, I'll tell you another story. First of all, shift gears. Think about riots. I was doing a home visit. We did home visits then. A woman in Harlem, a very lovely woman, beautiful home, immaculately clean, well-spoken, and it was like, it went well. And as I'm on my way out, she stops and looks back into her apartment and waves her hand and says, "Look at this terrible furniture. This is terrible. You need to get me some new furniture." And I'm looking at this furniture and going, I'm just starting my career. This is nicer than what I've got. And I didn't say it to her that way, but I said, "I'll talk to my supervisor and we'll see." Well, my supervisor said, "No, of course not." I thought that was the end of that. And about 3 months later, I'm walking through the same neighborhood, and there's this pile of familiar-looking furniture out on the street. So I went upstairs to check, was it hers? And sure enough, she greeted me at the door with a big smile, waves the hand. "You see, now I don't have furniture, you've got to buy me some." So I went back to my supervisor. And he went to his supervisor. And she went to her supervisor. And the next day the word came back to me, "Buy her the furniture. We don't want a riot. We don't want a long hot summer. Buy her the furniture." So this is part of my introduction to the real world. I've had that. A lot of my colleagues have not had that. The other story I was going to tell you, I lost it, but let me finish this story too. They were going to try to reform welfare. And they said, "Look, a lot of what's happening is it's so expensive, all of these home visits. What we will do is we will simply ask people to sign a form saying they're eligible. No more checking up on them." And they told us, "Well, you know, about 2% of the folks cheat. If we do this, we know there'll be more cheating. It'll go up to 5%. We can live with it. It'll still be cheaper than us checking up on people." You know, about a decade later, they finally did some studies, and you know what the level of cheating was? It was 50%, not 2%. You see, but I knew that because I was there and I saw people cheating left and right. But the folks who did the research, they didn't. They had their little research instruments and they asked people the question, "Do you do such a thing?" "No, not me." In other words, if you're not in the real world, if you don't have real experience, you can be seduced by all kinds of fancy-sounding ideas. By the time I became a sociologist, those things no longer fooled me.
Questions from the audience? audience because we've got about 15 minutes left.
Oh, my
And
goodness.
we like to pass the microphone around because it's being recorded and it's nothing more annoying than watching a recording and not being able to.
Oh, my God, now,
First one out here.
now I'm gonna be sued for what I said, okay?
Doctor, in higher education, what's the end result? I mean, online education is going to provide some competition. Frankly, if it were me and I was in charge, I'd just throw the whole bums out and start over and demand, that you had some kind of a quota of conservatives or something. But it's insanity, and having put one child through college, I wouldn't send another child through the same type of university because it truly is indoctrination. So what's the end game, and what can we do?
First of all, online is definitely not the answer. Part of what's been happening is, because these folks are ideologues, they can't afford to really be critical thinkers. They can brag about that, but the data isn't there. They're not critical thinkers. And so what they're teaching is in fact less and less deep, less and less demanding, more and more spoon feeding. This whole business with online courses is because it is cheaper. We know the quality is lower, okay? I mean, these folks are going to get their degrees, they're going to know nothing, okay? Now, if they get the degree from something like the University of Phoenix, people know it's the same as toilet paper. But the folks who get a degree from KSU, if it's online, it's going to be the same degree as if they come to classes. In classes, at least, you have the opportunity of stimulating people. Online, forget about it, it's boring. If people are already ready to learn, they can learn that way. Most of the younger folks are not. In other words, what's happening for the sake of money and political correctness is universities are in the process of committing suicide.
So how do we change the universities so they're more equally represented? You don't have this dogmatic liberalism.
First of all, even a university like KSU is a place where you can get a good education if you know how to get them. If you take the right professors, if you take the right courses, if you read the books, which nowadays almost nobody does. And by the way, that goes to the elite universities too. Okay, people are just not reading anymore. They're online, etc. Then maybe. My conclusion is this, however, and it's not a comforting conclusion. It's the same kind of conclusion I come to with respect to the larger political issues. And it's this: sometimes you have to have a crisis before people are willing to do anything. The folks that are running KSU, they know these things are going wrong. They told me so. But politically, they believe they've got no choice. And they think they're right. If they tried to buck the trend, they'd simply be fired. And they'd be replaced by somebody more compliant. We have to wait until universities become a waste of time, a waste of money, okay? More and more folks are going to get these degrees that are going to go out looking for jobs, and they think they're going to become CEO 6 months after, graduating. And they're going to discover that 6 months, or maybe 6 years later, they'll still be unemployed. And people are going to go, what are we doing? And only when there is a real catastrophe in terms of money, and they can do things. By the way, I see the same thing in sociology. It used to be just about as many sociology majors as psychology majors. Well, now sociology is trivial compared to psychology. Nevertheless, if you read what the sociologists write, they go, we've stopped the fall. We're not losing students anymore, therefore we're safe, we're okay. And it's like, well, wait, you were once relevant, you're now totally irrelevant. You're hanging on by your fingernails, but you're still hanging on, you're not dead yet. Ergo, everything's okay. We see that in society. I mean, we've had these 8 miserable years of Obama. Did people say, hey, we need to do something different? Look, the same people who complain about Obama, okay, they hated when people looked for Obama as the savior, and now they're looking to Trump as the savior. It's the same damn mindset. You've seen it fail, but you understand we're still not starving. The country is still chugging along. Look at the deficit, for heaven's sakes. You can calculate that this thing company is going to go broke in 10 or 20 years. It's inevitable. And what are they talking about? Spending another $10 trillion. We're not starving in the street yet. We need a catastrophe. That's just the way it seems to be with us human beings. You can warn people. I can't tell you how many times I have warned people about programs at KSU and said, this is not going to work, this is not going to work. And people tell me, you don't know what you're talking about. And they ignore me and go ahead and do it. And 2 years later, it doesn't work. You know, and it doesn't matter how often this happens. It's the same scenario keeps playing out over and over again. It's very sad, but it's the way it is.
I got a question in the back here.
Yes, I think your story at KSU would make a great movie. Personally, I would love to see that. But I would like to know in that movie what your story is, if you can remember it, where you were trudging along and enjoying the goodwill of everybody there, and suddenly the hairs on the back of your neck stood up. You know,
I pinpointed that moment. It was, but I went in to talk to the chair, whom I thought was a friend. I had helped her, she's helping me, and suddenly she's saying something that I couldn't imagine her saying. It was like, whoa, it was like a bucket of cold water in my face. And my initial response was, well, you can't be meaning this, in other words. And the more I tried to say, no, the rougher it got so bad that she was yelling at me. As an adult, I mean, I was yelled at as a kid, but as an adult, it does not happen very often. She was going to intimidate me and push me out. The problem is that I'm a stubborn SOB. I hang in there. Some of you, by the way, have tried to convert me. Don't waste your time.
Okay, one of the things you said earlier, I think most of us would agree with, is that you try to do the right thing. You said that that's what we should strive for, and I'm wondering, how do you discover the right thing? Is it certainly a matter of experience? Is there some sort of universal standard of rightness? And how do you convey or teach what's right?
Nowadays I call it the tripartite theory of morality. I write about it in my book called The Limits of Idealism. I wrote about it in more detail in a book called Hardball Without an Umpire. I've written about it in my book called Post-Liberalism a little bit too. Very briefly, in other words. See, remember, I'm a sociologist. So the question that people ask is what's right and what's wrong? It's not the question I asked. The question I asked was, what are people doing when they're engaged in morality? What's happening? In other words, to observe. And I came to a conclusion that it works something like this. And this is very brief, okay? That is said 3 parts. First of all, that moral rules, and I think moral rules are what's central to morality. Moral rules are informal rules that are paradigmatically learned. What does that mean, informal? It means that they're inexact and they're not stated in a precise form at all. For example, and, oh, by the way, that the way we learn them is from example, not from the precepts. We think they're encapsulated in the precept. What matters is what we learn by observing other people. So, simple example. Speed limits on the highway. They seem to be an exact rule. The rule says 65 miles per hour. But that's not the rule. Who the heck is riding 65 miles an hour? You go 65 miles an hour and you can get dirty looks because you're supposed to know that's really not what the rule is, okay? The rule is, well, what is the rule? Is it 10 miles above? Is it 8 miles above? Is it 15 miles above? I ask my students, we get different answers. I ask cops between CJ, they have different answers. There is no exact thing. How then do you learn this? Well, you learn it by seeing who the cops pull over and when they pull them over. You learn it by example, and examples are inherently imprecise. which is part of what morality is about, being imprecise. Because if you've got rules, there's no way that you can tell ahead of time everything that they've got to cover. So you need rules that give you some wiggle room. And that's what things do. And so people will say, yes, murder is wrong. But then the argument is, but what counts as murder? You know? Or you say, lying is wrong. Okay, well, does that mean never tell an untruth? Well, it turns out that sometimes you're supposed to tell untruths. You know? My favorite example, you know, it's World War II. The Nazis come to the door. You know, you've got some Jews in the basement. The Nazis say, you know, you stop. You got any Jews here? And you say, oh yeah, we've got some in the basement. No, you damn well better lie if you're a moral person. These things are complicated, and we need to understand these complications. That's part one. Part two, when things change and the rules need to change, and oh, by the way, they do change. If you look at societies, you will see that the rules are not the same. Even if people use the same words, you see it gets used in a very different way over time. The rules get renegotiated, and they get renegotiated in polarized negotiations. My simple example for this is abortion. Is abortion right? Is it wrong? It breaks down to two sides: pro-life, pro-choice. And both sides, the ones who argue the most vociferously, are the ones who are the most extreme in their positions. And they demand orthodoxy, and they don't listen to the other side, because the other side are a bunch of bums. Okay? Evil bums, no less. And it's these two sides that fight it out over time. And usually you wind up with something a little different than either of the sides had wanted. Again, my favorite example here is Protestants against Catholics, you know, during the Counter-Reformation. Each side was convinced they were right. They fought like crazy. What was the upshot? Neither side won. Instead, the rule changed and became one of tolerance. That became the rule. Nobody had envisioned that initially. And the last thing is that these rules are largely enforced by intense emotions. I gave you this example with anger. If somebody breaks an important rule and you don't get angry about it, hey, you don't think it's immoral. By the same token, if you need to feel guilt or shame. These are self-enforcement agents that we have. I'm simplifying a little bit, but it's a complicated process that takes place. And what we see is that morality changes as our social circumstances change. And different people, depending upon their own circumstance and their own experience and what gets them angry or happy or whatnot, influences what they will demand. And it's this community of conflicting demands that ultimately winds up with a rough consensus that people live by. But it's only a rough consensus, which means that we don't get to a point where we have absolutes. In other words, I'm saying morality is not absolute, but it's not relative either. It's not like there's a clear answer, but it's not that you can do whatever you want. It's a socially created, amorphous kind of set of prescriptions, informal rules that operates.
I think I have one other.
What can we do as parents to prepare our kids for college?
Homeschool.
All right, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. First of all, you start with yourself. What the research shows is that kids who do well in education have parents who believe in education. Kids pick up their attitudes of their parents. It's not a question of do as I say. Kids will do as you do. If you believe in learning, if you value it, the odds are if your kids like you, they will value it too. So, first thing, you start before school, you know. You teach them to read. You read to them. And as they're growing up, you have conversations with them, and you encourage them to be curious, and you encourage them to have opinions of their own. And you absolutely encourage reading, because reading is the key. It's still the key to this kind of thing. And then you be honest with them about what you believe and what you don't believe, and you give them But the way I describe it is, I call it limits with latitude. Limits with latitude. In other words, kids are kids. There are things they don't understand, there are things that are dangerous that they don't know. You have to say to the kids, this is a boundary, you can't go beyond that boundary. But within that boundary, you've got to give them latitude. You've got to give them an opportunity to make choices. Kids have to be given practice in making choices. So it's not like when you have a young kid, you say, eat your peas. You go, which would you like, peas or carrots? And this way you give them an opportunity to exercise decision-making. When you create that kind of person and you allow them to discover the things that matter for them, and then they can go to college and they can use what's available to them. In other words, they will, look, some students, because they're not interested in learning, they're not going to take me because I'm going to be demanding of them. They're going to go for the easy stuff. But if you've got students who understand that this is for them, and oh, by the way, this is crucial, it's got to be for them. They can't do it because it's the right thing. They've got to see it as something that they want. Now, sure, there are limits. You don't want them to be immoral, etc., but you want them ultimately to grow up to be their own persons. It's self-directed people. People who can make independent decisions, even in an atmosphere of uncertainty, who are the folks who are going to be successful. And that includes the courage and what have you. You know, to make mistakes. One of the things that I learned that my father never taught me is that the problem is not making mistakes. The problem is not learning from your mistakes and fixing your mistakes. I hate to make mistakes, but what I hate even worse is holding on to a mistake. Okay? If kids have the right attitude, then you allow them to move in their own direction. You give them support. You give them your honest opinions. You don't play this game. I'm the older generation, and what the hell do I know? No, you say what you honestly think. That's if you want your children to respect you, you want to be somebody who's worthy of being respected. You do that, the kids will usually be okay. Does that answer the question?
A question down here.
I think you've made several of the points I was going to preface my question with, and that is that cultures, which you've said get formed by the decisions being observed and mores get set for the organizations. It seems like universities, we're going to wrap them all up in one. We've hit a crisis point with all the things you talked about. That the universities themselves have formed a culture where they've highly left the process by which professors are kept, all the things you talked about. So why not at this point, California's done, Florida's done, and others, why not just say, look, I think we got to start, so let's do this. Let's abolish all tenure. All tenure for professors, because it was put there to protect professors. Tenure was there so you could teach what you wanted to and do it without put over rework. Why not do away with it and then restrict the budget of the university and force a lot of people out?
Not going to happen. Not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen.
Why not?
Thank you. What I'm going to share with you is my idea now, okay? And it's not completely formed, so bear with me, okay? I have come to the conclusion that if you are going to change a culture, and this culture is deeply entrenched, you have to have an idea to oppose it with. Now, religion is one of these ideas that's been used to oppose the mess that we've got right now. And it works for some people, but frankly, my opinion now, it's not going to change society. We're a secular society. We're going to become more secular, not less secular. In other words, when you have a physical problem, you go to a doctor, you don't go to a minister. That's going to continue to happen. We're going to become secular. But some of the other answers, the way I describe them is there are three main ideological traditions that we have. We have roughly the spiritual communitarian tradition, the market-oriented individualistic tradition, and the bureaucratic collectivist tradition, socialism. I'm saying none of them work. They all, at least in their entirety, they were all created in a period well before our own. They were created to solve problems different from the ones that we need to solve. And so I've been looking for an alternative, and the alternative that I've gotten right now is social individualism. We live in a society where we've got all kinds of choices, but we don't know what choices to make, okay? And we get pushed around by people telling us they know the answers, and too often they're demagogues. What we need are people capable of self-direction, capable of people who understand that we are social beings and understanding our needs as social beings. That means we need not simple answers, but answers that are a little bit more complex, but not so complex that people can't gravitate to them. In other words, we've got to develop people who believe in things and are willing to live by them. Let me go a step further. Part of this thing is we need morality. You're religious folks, you know we need morality. I agree with you about 100%. I look for, okay, my experience, what are the principles that are most applicable to our society that we should be holding on to and fighting for? And to me, I boil it down to 5. Now, there are other things that count, but to me, these are the 5 most important ones. Number 1, honesty. Number 2, responsibility. Number 3, fairness, but not in terms of equality. Fairness in terms of universality, same rules for everybody. 4, family values. Family matters. It still matters very much. And finally, liberty, the freedom to make choices. Those 5 things should be the principles that guide our society, and I chose them specifically because I have principles that appeal to people on the left and the right that are specific to the kind of society in which we live, in which we do have these freedoms, we do have these choices, but we need to be dedicated to some guideposts. These are guideposts that I think give us the flexibility to do the kinds of things we need. One of the things that I've mentioned over and over again, I believe in so much. Honesty, 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 honesty. If you're dealing in a world of strangers and you've got to depend upon other people, you need to know you can depend upon their word. We can't do more, certainly not in politics. This bodes very ill for our future. And we need to understand that and care about it and fight for it. I don't see people fighting for it. So I'm looking to see if ultimately we can create some kind of social movements in this direction instead of these damn socialist movements. In other words, forgive me, not a specifically religious movement, because I don't think that's going to work, but a movement that helps us to deal with the issues that require us to make these independent decisions. In other words, look, we're still going to live in nuclear families. It's still going to be mom and pop and the kids and whatnot. Look, another book that I'm trying to sell right now, I just completed it, manuscript. It's titled, Saving Our Marriages, Saving Ourselves. And my diagnosis here is this, that part of the problem we're dealing with is we now have what I call voluntary intimacy. We live in a world where you don't have to get married anymore. In other words, the market economy is so effective that we can live on our own. Women don't have to marry in order to support themselves. Men don't need to marry in order to get their shirts laundered. I mean, both men and women can take care of themselves. So you get married only if you want to. But then the next part of it is you stay married only if you know how to. And folks get some very important lessons, okay? But they're not going to listen. there's got to be a way to get through to these people. There's got to be a way to literally bring us together based upon the things that we need to do to make our society work and to have our lives work within this society, our society.
Thank you, Melvyn.